Hey there! In this module, Module 16, we're going to be talking about speciation, the formation of new species, and the pace of evolution, and how they are connected. So let me start talking about microevolution and macroevolution. If we remember that microevolution, we can see here is the small changes in population over time. So sometimes species will get larger and sometimes they'll get smaller and they'll change color. But at the end of the day, these species can still interbreed to produce fertile offspring. But over time, these microevolution, these small changes in DNA add up and we have large changes in DNA and therefore large changes in populations over time. And so microevolution is around us everywhere. We see it in drug-resistant bacteria. We've talked about it in dog breeding and in our agricultural crops with our brassicas. However, these examples don't show us the changes, the macroevolution. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of ways that speciation occurs, or this macroevolution. How do we move from microevolution to macroevolution? So allopatric speciation is going to be our first example, and this is known as geographic speciation. Geographic speciation is easy to remember if you think about a geographic barrier. A geographic barrier like a mountain rising up and splitting a population in two. So here's our population here, our initial population. And then let's say a river started to run through this population and they get separated. And this can be a river, like I said, it could be mountains. It could also be a highway. It could be a road if it's a very small population, if it's a very small organism in that population. So even a road could be a huge barrier. But for even larger animals, a highway system is a pretty intense geographic barrier. And this can, in fact, separate populations. And so if a population is separated, it's going to eventually no longer be able to interbreed if they are physically separated. And after a while, after physical separation, the species, since they can no longer interbreed, are going to reach reproductive isolation. This means that they can no longer reproduce. And so this can be because of physical reasons. Maybe they physically can no longer reproduce. Maybe it could be genetically, but it would be physiological. But there's also non-physiological. So sometimes the changes are not something that you can see. If you were to take a bird that had been separated from its population, from the ancestral population, and try and return it back to the ancestral population, perhaps maybe the bird song of the new founder population is going to have changed. And so if it can't attract a mate with this new bird song, well then it can't interbreed, and so it has reached reproductive isolation. A famous example of reproductive isolation as a result of allopatric speciation is Darwin's finches. So Darwin's finches lived in the Galapagos, or still do live in the Galapagos Islands. And there was an ancestral finch, the ancestor to all of the finches in the Galapagos today, that over time would migrate to new islands, but the migration was so far that they weren't able to come back, so they started populating the islands over time. But the islands presented different environments and therefore different selective pressures. Some of the islands had only seeds, and some of the islands had only berries. Some of the islands had only insects. And so in order to survive, the birds had to develop different types of beaks over time to be able to get enough food to survive. And so if you were to put this bird that is able to eat grubs back with the ancestral population, they may not and actually cannot interbreed anymore. And it's for physiological and non-physiological reasons. Symmetric speciation is without geographic barriers. And so this means that organisms still living side by side for some reason, are unable to reproduce. And a reason for this oftentimes is going to be polyploidy. And if I take you back in time for a moment to biology class, if you remember meiosis, polyploidy occurred during the separation of the chromosomes. So if we look here, this is meiosis 2, and the chromosomes, if everything went right, would split. One half of the chromosome would go to one side and the other half would go to the other side. But sometimes accidents happen, and the entire chromosome will go to one side and nothing will go to the other side. And so that's going to result in a gamete here with extra chromosomes, and this is called polyploidy, a sperm or an egg that has an extra set of chromosomes. And this sperm or egg is going to have no chromosomes and will not survive. And so polyploidy usually produces species that are larger. It has been known to occur in animals, salamanders and snails, but if it occurs in a human gamete, it always leads to an unsuccessful gamete because humans are too complex to be able to undergo or to have polyploidy. But it is common in plants. We see it all the time. And so we see here, if you remember once again, biology class, we took the DNA out of strawberries and made necklaces because strawberries are octoploids, meaning they have 8 sets of chromosomes. And here is a plant that is reticulatum that is an 84 ploid. And so once an organism undergoes polyploidy, or the gamete is polyploid and reproduces successfully, the offspring is going to no longer generally be able to interbreed with the ancestral population. And that is instant speciation right there. And therefore you have two different species living beside each other and not able to interbreed anymore. And so that is an example of sympatric speciation. Let's now talk about the pace of evolution by natural selection. This is going to be based on the ability of the organism to adapt. How quickly can an organism adapt to changes in the environment? And this should make sense if you think about it. The quicker that a population can reproduce, the more quickly they're going to have mutations add up and changes build up and adaptations accrue. And if you can accrue more adaptations, you're going to be able to adapt more quickly. And so therefore, evolution will occur in populations that can reproduce more quickly and have quicker generations. If changes cannot happen quickly, then species cannot adapt. And so this is the case we see right now with climate change. Our climate is not going to reach, our global climate is not going to reach temperatures that the Earth has never been to before. The problem that we're seeing is that it's getting there faster. The temperatures are increasing faster than species can adapt to. And so therein lies our problem. And so some species are going to be able to adapt quickly and some won't. An example of rapid evolution we have seen in isolated lakes, one in Africa called Lake Tanganyika, and there is understood to be one ancestral cichlid, and that this over several million years, which seems like a long time for evolution to happen, actually is pretty fast to have produced so many. It's understood to have about 200 different species of cichlids that are vastly different. And so for so many changes to happen and that quick of time, that is an example of rapid evolution. There's another example of rapid evolution in Death Valley in California and Nevada. There's an isolated lake out there where pupfishes have been feeling environmental pressures and adapting to the changes. And over just 20,000 to 30,000 years, they've seen a few different species of fish evolve. And That is pretty cool, and that is very rapid evolution. So evolution by artificial selection is extremely rapid because the selective pressure is great because it is being induced by humans. And an example, an unintended example that we are seeing in Atlantic cod is that when people go fishing, they obviously are going to want to pull out the largest fish. And so people have been fishing for the largest cod in the Atlantic and pulling out the largest fish. And it is understood that the larger fish actually mature later in life. And so we're leaving in the water the smaller, quicker reproducing salmon. I'm just kidding, cod. And so it's changing the dynamic of the population to leave the more quickly reproducing fish, which sometimes it seems like change can be a bad thing, but this might be a good thing for the cod because perhaps maybe it'll allow the cod to adapt to a quickly changing ocean. We just don't know. And so finally, on our last slide, we're talking about GMOs, or genetic modified organisms. If we look here, a genetic modified organism is one that we have created. We have taken the genes or the genetic material and we have recombined it with that of a bacteria. So here we have found a bacteria that is able to resist insecticide just naturally. And what scientists do is we take that gene out. So if this is the genetic material, they take that gene out and they insert it into over here the DNA of corn plant. And so now the corn plant is able to resist insecticide. And this is a more targeted approach to being able to repel insects. And so this is, can be considered a good thing because that means that's less pesticides that we have to spray on the ground. And so the less pesticides we have to spray on the ground, the less that's going to get into our rivers and hopefully into ourselves. So this is called right here. It is Bt corn and Bt cotton because it's bacterial corn and bacterial cotton, or the enzymes. I'm sorry, the genes of a bacteria are implanted into corn and cotton. And so this is an example of extremely fast evolution because we are changing the DNA of these plants. And that is it for Module 16. I hope you have a great day.